Hi. So, hope you're all having a great afternoon and that you're staying dry and out of the weather. For the Wednesday class, we had to cancel because of the bad weather. I live in North Denton County, and while the roads didn't look too bad in Southern Denton County, I really didn't want to risk having to sleep in my office tonight if the weather turned bad. So I did want to take a moment to kind of go through some of the notes that we missed in class today and the discussion, so that way you have a pretty good idea of how to get started writing the discussion section. So if you will pull up the writing discussion section notes, I'm going to go through that, and you have it in Canvas for you to look at. But if you recall from our discussion on Monday in class that your paper is going to have an introduction, two discussion sections, and a conclusion. And we talked in class on Monday about the three main rhetorical moves that you have in an introduction: your lead-in, your background article reference, and your thesis statement. You want to keep in mind that your lead-in opens up the conversation, that people have been talking about advertisements well before you came into this conversation, and they'll continue to talk about them after you leave the conversation. And so you want to pay pay respects to the conversations that people have had in the past and that will continue to have. That's kind of a fundamental feature of academic writing. So you have a lead-in, a background article reference. In this case, your background article reference should come from Davis. The cultural myths article is the foundational, the foundation of the research of the paper that you're writing. And so the Davis article should be the background article reference that you use in this introduction. And then you'll have a thesis statement. And a couple of key points that you want to make sure you introduce the reader to in your introduction is cultural myths, right? Since that's the main point of this paper. Advertising, right? Because we're talking about advertising, so you can't just kind of like fail to introduce it in your introduction. And cultural myths, advertising, and then the two myths that you're specifically addressing. So those kind of give you an idea of kind of how to get started with your introduction. Your introduction, like I said in class, should be about 3/4 of a page to a page long. Shorter introduction, shorter paper, longer introduction, longer paper. So considering that this is about a 4 to 5 page paper, you're looking at about 3/4 of a page to a page introduction. Your introduction can also be more than one paragraph. You're probably very familiar with the one paragraph introduction. And while that is effective for a shorter paper, as you move throughout your academic career, you're going to have to write much longer papers that have many more moving pieces and parts to it. And so your introduction will have to do quite a few things that you really probably can't accomplish with just a one paragraph introduction. So, introduction, lead-in, background article reference, thesis statement. Now, remember how we talked about in class that you're probably very familiar also with talking about body paragraphs, and we're going to move away from that terminology for the remainder of the semester. You're probably very familiar with the 5-paragraph essay where you write the 3 body paragraphs. And that's an effective way to organize a paper when you're kind of first getting started with academic discourse, when you're first learning to kind of make arguments and support them with research. But as you move throughout your academic career, that organization model isn't really going to be as effective because you'll have to do a lot of things in your papers that can't really be contained in just a single paragraph. Or even 3 paragraphs. So for the remainder of the semester, we're going to refer to them as discussion sections. And those are kind of main ideas or concepts that you're going to discuss or approach or investigate or analyze in your paper. So for this paper, you're going to have 2 discussion sections. Each discussion section will be about one of the cultural myths that you are analyzing in your advertisement. So perhaps you'll have an introduction and the first cultural myth, your body is not good enough. You'll look at that as it's reflected in the ad, and then you'll bring in research to support that. So let's look at the discussion section notes. So we've talked a little bit about moving away from the 5-paragraph essay and moving more towards an introduction and discussion sections and conclusion. And so if you'll notice on the notes, I've kind of provided some guidelines or some suggestions to keep in mind. That's my dog in the background. So your discussion sections, topically organized. In this case, cultural myths. Might include a subject heading to help set it off for your readers. So just like we practiced last week in the week 5 reflection, incorporating discussion headings, and just like we talked about in the quiz that you can have subject headings to help orientate or navigate your reader through the text, you'll have subject headings for this paper as well. Your discussion sections can be longer than a paragraph, and they will typically move from general to specific. So some important rhetorical moves within the discussion section that you might really want to consider. You're going to make a point. In this case, it'll be your topic sentence. Some topic sentences can be as explicit as saying, one cultural myth identified in the advertisement for Dolce & Gabbana is that happiness, satisfaction, and sex appeal are available with the next purchase. So you can have a topic sentence that is that direct. One cultural myth is, and then you state what the cultural myth. But then you also want to make sure you explain your point. So it's not enough just to say that one ad identifies the cultural myth of happiness, satisfaction, and sex appeal are available with the next purchase. But you have to explain what that means. What does it mean that you can buy sex appeal? What does it mean that you can buy happiness with a product? We talked a little bit about that last week in the discussion forum about the Jean Kilbourne article. And so that's kind of where you're going here, is that you need to explain what this cultural myth means. So you're going to make your point in your topic sentence, you're going to explain your point, and then you're going to need to offer evidence to support that point. So in this case, you'll have two types of evidence. You'll have first the advertisement. You need to make sure that you offer specific examples from the advertisement. For example, in this ad, we see a model draped in expensive clothing, wearing a beautiful satin purple gown, and she's standing in the desert looking forlorn into the distance. So you want to make sure you explain and connect specifically to the advertisement. The other type of evidence that you'll have for this paper would include outside research. So if you remember in class, we talked about how there will be at least 4 sources on your Works Cited page. The advertisement, the Davis article, and then 2 outside sources for support. So it's not enough to say that, for example, an ad for Victoria's Secrets engages in fat shaming. Go out and see what other people are saying about that ad too. Is your analysis correct? Is it far off? Is it spot on? What are some other scholars or critics or reporters saying about your ad as well? What are people saying about fat shaming in advertising? Or what are people saying about this incessant consumerism that kind of encourages people to spend more money than they have, to buy expensive clothes or too much alcohol? So it's not enough just to say we see this in the ad here, but you also need more people, more support, research to back it up, what you're saying. So if you look at the organization in the notes, make a point, explain your point, offer evidence to support your point, and then you need to bring it all together. Now, one of the things that I saw very frequently in the literacy narratives that I commented on quite a bit was there weren't enough connections to the audience or to the larger so what here. So what does it mean to say that an advertisement encourages people to spend money that they don't have under this pursuit of happiness? What does that mean for me? I don't think I do that, do I? Do other people do that? Why is it important that we consider or think about cultural myths? What does it matter for the rest of us or somebody reading your paper? Why is it important? So you want to make sure that you illustrate or make the connection to how this all comes together. So I put in a couple of examples, and I even put kind of a little way of thinking about organizing it. A colleague of mine calls it PIES: point, interpretation, example, and then the so what. So here's an example of some discussion sections from a similar topic. The topic differs, but the organization is very similar, and the assignment directions were very similar. These were papers about the same length, based in a Composition 1 class. So let's look at the first example. It says the purpose of education, enlightenment. So there's the subject heading. So enlightening young minds with new ideas in school is the first step to creating something spectacular. We are always looking for new ways to understand science, math, and literature. After all, these subjects, which make up our contemporary liberal arts tradition, build upon and inform each other. So notice here that this is a topic sentence that doesn't come out and say one purpose of education is enlightenment, but it's an implied topic sentence. And so it fulfills the goal of telling your reader that enlightenment is one purpose for school, right? And then it explains what that means, that enlightenment is thinking about science and history and math and literature in new ways that build upon each other in the liberal arts tradition. And now this writer is also going into the research. As far back as 150 years ago, at the genesis of the American public university system, scholars justified the liberal arts tradition because, as Cardinal John Henry Newman suggests in his essay, The Idea of a University, everything is built upon the basic roots of knowledge. Specifically, Newman states, in the combination of colors, very different effects are produced by a difference in their selection and juxtaposition. Newman uses an analogy about colors to show how, when colors are not presented alone but combined together, they create a completely different image that illuminates and transforms the other. This same concept applies to the acquisition of knowledge through formal education. Combining two subjects and ideas may expand the minds of not one, but many, and this creates something unique, enlightening, and transformative, both for ourselves and in others. So if you'll notice, this writer is following the organizational model that we talked about earlier. Topic sentence, explanation, source for support, bringing it all together. The writer does the same thing in the second paragraph with a different source. More recently, though, educators and scholars have addressed how an education can both enlighten oneself and others. Still, enlightening others through education goes beyond the classroom, as Newman imagined it. Our experiences outside the classroom can transform our way of thinking and lead to new reforms of this world. We can see this, for example, in professor and writer Olivia Castellano's essay. Castellano describes how she struggled to find her identity as a woman, scholar, and educator. However, Castellano's passion for language propelled her forward while in school in Los Angeles in the 1960s and 70s. Socially oppressive systems conspired to suggest often and frequently that Castellano was defective, inferior, or incapable. This, instead, led Castellano to, quote, prove to anyone who cared to ask that she, the daughter of a laborer farm worker, could dare to be different. Castellano's success in education served as a model of the possibilities for Hispanic women and men who may have been shunned away from education. In challenging those who suggested Castellano should be a second-class citizen unworthy of an education, Castellano served as an example of how one person can achieve greatness and enlighten the minds of many others who shared her same struggle. Enlightening society as a whole by impacting the individuals within helped Castellano and others accomplish what they never thought was possible. So that's an example of a second paragraph in the same discussion section talking about the purpose of education is enlightenment. John Henry Newman is focusing on enlightenment of the self, and Castellano is focusing on enlightenment of others. If you look at the third example, there's also another example in regard to the purposes of horror films. And if you'll notice, this one has a topic sentence that's more explicit. One purpose that horror films serve is that they allow audiences to, quote, dare the nightmare and remain unaltered. Topic sentence. Now, here's the explanation. Horror films create suspense using images that symbolize our fears about death, destruction, and the afterlife, or the unknown, all of which we might be curious about, but that also frighten us. Good visual images keep the audience on the edge of their seats since they don't know what is to come, yet they are often begging for more. So here's the explanation. So we have a topic sentence, explanation. Now we're moving into the source for support. Stephen King writes about this effect in Why We Crave Horror Movies. Quote, when we pay $4 or $5 and seat ourselves at 10th row center in a theater showing a horror movie, we are daring the nightmare. Now we're moving into the part where we actually explain what Stephen King meant in our own words. King argues that we want to be scared and want to be on the, edge of our seats with the unknowing ahead. It feels cathartic to see the worst that can happen to someone or to see the worst behaviors in others. And then we leave the theater knowing that we are safe and that there are people out there worse than we are. Just as in the classic film, The Sixth Sense, we want to, quote, see dead people too. Then the writer goes into a specific example. So this third illustration, or this third example, is a really great model for you to see how you can tie a point back to an outside source and then connect it to a text that you're analyzing. So for your paper, maybe you talk about the cultural myths and then you offer a specific example from the text, or from the ad, or maybe you talk about the ad first and then you offer outside research to support. And so you'll see in that second paragraph, in that third example, that we're also doing what we've talked about, moving from general to specific. So we have a general example from the orphanage, but then it moves into a specific scene, including a specific quote. And then it concludes that paragraph talking about the significance, about why this matters for the rest of us. So hopefully this gives you some kind of ideas about how to organize your discussion sections that you will need to write this week to turn in for Sunday. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'll be online most of the week and I can answer any questions, but you want to make sure that you have written about 4 paragraphs by Sunday, which would come out to approximately 2 pages typed double-spaced of your introduction and your discussion 1. All right, and then next week we'll start on discussion 2, and then we'll start on the conclusion, and then the week after that we'll revise it and get it ready to turn in before spring break. All right, well, have a great weekend. If you have any questions, feel free to email me.